Hello and welcome. Today we will be exploring landmark Supreme Court cases addressing civil liberties. Have you ever had to give someone directions somewhere and told them to do something like turn left at the big statue or take a right at that old tree? When we give directions like that, we're using landmarks to help people find their way. We also have landmarks in civic life that help us understand our liberties. These landmark cases decided by the U.S. Supreme Court have a significant impact on the lives of citizens and non-citizens alike. In this video, we will explore 3 landmark cases that impacted civil liberties, or the rights guaranteed by the laws of the country, such as the rights and protections included in the Bill of Rights. After watching this video, you will be able to use primary sources to assess the significance of landmark U.S. Supreme Court cases. Evaluate how landmark U.S. Supreme Court cases have had an impact on society, and recognize and/or apply constitutional principles and/or rights in relation to relevant U.S. Supreme Court cases. Don't forget that because of an early case, Marbury v. Madison, the U.S. Supreme Court assumed the authority to determine the constitutionality of laws, or whether something actually agrees with the Constitution. So let's take a look at 3 Supreme Court cases that have had a significant impact on civil liberties and the law in the United States. The first case that we will look at is the United States v. Nixon. This case deals with one of the most important ideas of our Constitution, that everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. This means that even the president has to follow the same laws as every person living in the country, but it took a Supreme Court decision to make this clear. Back in 1970, 5 men broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington, D.C. These men were working for President Nixon's campaign for re-election. When it was discovered during the investigation, Nixon was ordered to turn over any audio tapes where he may have discussed what happened with his aides. Nixon said the tapes were protected by his executive privilege, or the belief that conversations between the president and his aides were private and he did not have to turn them over because he was president. The U.S. government took Nixon to court, arguing that he had the same responsibility to follow the law as all citizens did. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed. Let's take a look at what they said. Neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the generalized need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. So what does this principle here mean, and how does it impact society? Well, the U.S. v. Nixon is a pretty important case because it makes it clear that everyone is equal before the law and that the rule of law applies to even the President of the United States of America. Let's check in. How did the case of the United States v. Nixon demonstrate that all citizens are equal in the eyes of the law? Answer: the Supreme Court declared that even the President of the United States has to follow the law. There's another case involving 2 presidential candidates that had a significant impact on the nation. Back in 2000, Republican George W. Bush was in a very close election with Democrat Al Gore. The election came down to who would be declared the popular vote winner in the state of Florida, claiming all of Florida's electoral votes. Unfortunately, there were some problems with some of the ballots in Florida counties, so the state Supreme Court ordered a hand recount of the votes in the counties that had the problems. Ahead in the race, Bush asked the U.S. Supreme Court to stop the recount, arguing that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Because that clause says states must apply the law equally to everyone, Bush argued that state election officials could not do a recount of some votes. State election officials had to recount all votes, or some citizens would be discriminated against. In Bush v. Gore, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed and ordered an end to the recount. So let's see what the court said in its decision. The Equal Protection Clause's requirements apply to the manner in which the voting franchise is exercised. Having once granted the right to vote on equal terms, Florida may not, by later arbitrary or disparate treatment, value one person's vote over that of another. So what does this mean here, and how does it impact society? Well, the judicial opinion in Bush v. Gore set a precedent for similar cases to follow. Election rules are made by each state, and states have many different ways of counting votes. But in this case, the Supreme Court said that the Florida Supreme Court acted unconstitutionally and violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause when it decided that only certain votes would be recounted. We could also say it reinforced the idea of the supremacy clause. After all, by ordering an end to the recount, it overrode the decision of the Florida Supreme Court. Let's check in. Why did the partial recount in Florida, ordered by the state Supreme Court, violate the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution? Answer: the recount did not treat everyone's vote as equal, so a partial recount couldn't be done because state election officials would be discriminating against other groups of citizens whose votes were not recounted. We have one more case to talk about in our video, and it's a recent case that has greatly impacted our civil liberties, and that's District of Columbia versus Heller. Back in early 2000, District of Columbia, also known as Washington, D.C., passed an ordinance that limited the rights of gun owners. A group of private gun owners, including Mr. Heller, filed a suit in the federal courts, claiming that the ordinance violated their Second Amendment right to bear arms. The federal court said it did not because the Second Amendment only protected ownership for guns for militias, or groups of people who are not part of the military but are trained like soldiers for emergencies, such as the National Guard. Heller appealed to the Supreme Court, and he won. Let's take a look at the words of the Supreme Court. The Second Amendment protects an individual's rights to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia, and to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. So, what does this principle mean here, and how does it impact society? Well, in D.C. versus Heller, the judicial opinion focused on the meaning of the Second Amendment's right to bear arms. The Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment is that individuals, not just militias, have the rights to own or carry a weapon. This could make it even more difficult for cities and states to put restrictions on the rights to bear arms, an important liberty within our Bill of Rights. Let's check in. How did the Supreme Court interpret the Second Amendment in the D.C. versus Heller case? Answer: they ruled that the Second Amendment applies to all individuals, not just militias. In this video, we talked a great deal about 3 cases which have had a significant impact on society. So let's recap and try to answer some questions for yourself. Question 1. Based on what you learned about the U.S. Supreme Court in the United States versus Nixon, how would you respond to a president who declares that if the president does it, then it means it's not illegal? Well, he or she is wrong. Everyone is legally equal in the eyes of the law, so even the president has to follow the law. Question 2. How did the constitutional principle in Bush versus Gore impact society? It set a precedent about making sure that state election rules and laws are not discriminatory and do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Question 3. How did the constitutional principle in District of Columbia versus Heller impact society? It said that the right to bear arms was an individual right protected under the Second Amendment and did not just apply to militias. It also made it harder to put limits on gun rights. Did you get them all? Good job! Be sure to check out the companion videos on cases relating to civil liberties and civil rights if you have not watched them already. Thank you for watching.